She devoted 23 years of her life to caring for her paralyzed husband, working her ass off to support the two of them. But one day, small oddities began to alarm her. Dot. Determined to install a hidden camera, she uncovered a truth that turned her world upside down. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Where are you watching our videos from? Write in the comments. Evelyn Johnson had never imagined that her life would turn into a monotonous cycle of care, exhaustion, and silence. At 45, she barely recognized herself in the reflection of the bathroom mirror each morning. The woman who once dreamed of becoming an artist, who loved bright colors and the soft touch of a brush against the canvas, was now a stranger. Her hands, once meant for creating, were rough from years of scrubbing, lifting, and tending to a man who could do nothing for himself, or so she believed. Her husband, Richard Johnson, had been bedridden for 23 years. He had been in a car accident 2 years after their wedding, an event that had defined both of their lives ever since. The doctors had said he would never walk again, that his spinal injury was irreversible. And Evelyn, young and in love, had vowed to care for him. She had promised to be there through sickness and health, even when sickness became the defining element of their existence. The house had long since ceased to be a home. It was now a hospital, filled with medical equipment, sterile supplies, and the constant hum of a feeding pump. The air smelled of antiseptic and worn-out linens. In the dim light of the bedroom, Richard lay on his mechanical bed, his body seemingly lifeless, his once charming face hollowed by years of immobility. His blue eyes, still sharp and observant, followed Evelyn as she moved around, but they never spoke of gratitude. He simply existed, while she ensured his survival. Evelyn's routine was exhausting. She worked as a night shift nurse at the local hospital, spending long hours tending to strangers, only to come home and continue the same role for the man she had married. She bathed him, changed his linens, administered his medication, and spoon-fed him carefully. She handled all the finances, managed their house, and kept up with the endless cycle of medical appointments. She had given up on dreams long ago. She used to love painting, used to have a small studio in the guest room where she would spend hours lost in her imagination. But after Richard's accident, the brushes were put away, the canvases were stored in the attic, and the room was converted into a storage space for his medical supplies. There was no time for art, no time for herself. The world outside moved on without her. Friends who once visited slowly stopped coming, their lives filled with their own families, careers, and aspirations. Even Richard's family had faded away over the years, their initial visits becoming less frequent until they simply stopped altogether. She could hardly blame them. What was there to say to a woman whose entire life revolved around tending to a husband who could do nothing but blink in response? Her only real human interaction outside of work was with her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Carter, who sometimes stopped by with a plate of food and a sympathetic smile. "How do you do it, dear?" the old woman had asked one day, watching as Evelyn scrubbed the front steps. "I don't have a choice," Evelyn had replied, forcing a smile. Mrs. Carter had sighed, shaking her head. "We always have choices, honey. We just don't always see them." At the time, Evelyn had dismissed the words, but lately something had begun to shift in her mind. It started with small things. A misplaced object here, an unusual sound there. The glass of water she always left full on Richard's bedside table. Sometimes she would return to find it half empty. The kitchen stool, which was always tucked under the counter, would occasionally be slightly out of place. She convinced herself she was imagining things. stress, exhaustion, maybe even early signs of paranoia. But the incidents continued. One night, after finishing her shift at the hospital, she came home later than usual. As she stepped inside, she could swear she heard the faint creak of a floorboard from the bedroom. Her heart pounded, but when she entered, Richard was exactly as she had left him, motionless, his head tilted slightly to one side, eyes closed as if in deep sleep. She felt foolish for even considering it, and yet the unease did not fade. It built up over the weeks, accumulating in her chest like an unbearable weight. Until finally, she decided to do something she had never considered before. She would install a camera. The decision came late one night after a particularly exhausting shift at the hospital. She sat at the kitchen table staring at her reflection in the window, her fingers curled tightly around a cup of tea. She thought about the misplaced objects, the strange noises, the nagging feeling in her gut that something was wrong. And then she thought about the past 23 years, the sacrifices, the loneliness, the dreams she had buried. Enough. She searched online for a small, discreet camera, something she could hide easily in the bedroom without Richard noticing. As she clicked the purchase button, a strange sensation washed over her. It wasn't just anxiety or fear, it was something else, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, anticipation. For the first time in over 2 decades, she was about to uncover the truth. The small, discreet camera arrived 2 days later, packed neatly inside a brown box with no distinguishing marks. Evelyn opened it with steady hands, even though her heart pounded erratically. It was barely the size of a coin, easy to hide, easy to forget. She spent a few moments studying it, feeling an odd mixture of guilt and determination swirling inside her. Was she really doing this? A part of her still felt foolish. Maybe she was imagining things, seeing ghosts where there were none. But another part of her, the part that had sacrificed 23 years of her life, the part that had learned to ignore her own exhaustion for the sake of duty, needed to know. That evening, after finishing Richard's nightly care routine, she took advantage of the moment when he was half dozing under the dim glow of the bedside lamp. Moving carefully, she positioned the camera on the bookshelf, angling it so that it captured the entire bedroom, including his hospital bed. She made sure it blended in among the dust-covered books and old photo frames, one of which still displayed a picture of them on their wedding day. How young and hopeful she had been. How blind. She forced herself to stop reminiscing and left the room, making sure everything looked exactly as it always did. That night, Evelyn barely slept. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through every possibility. What if she was wrong? What if nothing happened? What if... She shut her eyes. She would find out soon enough. The next morning, she waited until Richard had fallen into one of his long, silent stretches, staring blankly at the ceiling as she tidied up the house. Moving swiftly, she retrieved the camera, connected it to her laptop, and pressed play. The first few hours of footage were uneventful. The room remained still, the only movement coming from the soft flicker of light filtering through the curtains. Richard, as expected, did not move, but then, somewhere past midnight, the shift began. Evelyn's breath hitched as she watched. At first, it was just a twitch, a barely noticeable movement in his fingers. Then, slowly, deliberately, Richard lifted his head. She gripped the edge of the table, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. On the screen, Richard turned his head from side to side, scanning the room. His eyes were alert, alive, not the vacant, distant stare she had grown used to over the years. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he sat up. Evelyn covered her mouth with her hand, a muffled gasp escaping from between her fingers. Richard stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders as though shaking off years of stiffness. He flexed his fingers, rubbed his face, then swung his legs over the side of the bed. And he stood. Not just stood, walked, with ease, like someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Evelyn felt nausea rise in her throat. On the screen, Richard made his way to the kitchen, moving smoothly in the dark like a man who knew the layout of his home perfectly. He pulled open the refrigerator, took out a beer, twisted the cap off, and drank. Her mind reeled. She watched as he moved around, gathering food, making a sandwich with a practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time. How long? How many nights had she been asleep, exhausted from working 2 jobs while he enjoyed himself in secret? Her hands trembled as she fast-forwarded through the footage. Richard ate, watched television, stretched his legs as though they had never failed him. Then, just before dawn, he returned to the bedroom, tidied the blankets, carefully positioned himself back into the bed, and assumed his usual vacant expression. The performance was seamless. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. A lie. 23 years. Her entire life had been shaped around a lie. A storm of emotions crashed over her, one after the other: rage, humiliation, betrayal. She had given up everything for this man: her dreams, her youth, her freedom. She had broken her back, taken care of someone who didn't need her. And he had let her. Evelyn's breathing grew ragged. She could have forgiven so many things. But this was unforgivable. She needed air. Shoving away from the table, she stumbled to the front door, stepping out into the cold morning air. The street was quiet, the sky a soft, pale blue. She inhaled deeply, trying to still the rage pounding inside her. Mrs. Carter, her elderly neighbor, was watering her plants on her porch. The woman glanced over and smiled. "Morning, dear," she said. Evelyn forced a smile. "Morning." Mrs. Carter tilted her head. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Evelyn let out a dry, humorless laugh. Something close to a ghost, she thought. Something that had been haunting her life for over 2 decades. She turned back toward the house. She needed to think, because now that she knew the truth, she wasn't going to sit quietly. No, she was going to do something about it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She moved through her routine mechanically, her body operating on autopilot while her mind spun through the implications of what she had discovered. When she fed Richard his lunch, her hands were steady, her face impassive. When she adjusted his pillows, she made sure to meet his eyes, searching for something, anything, that would hint at guilt. But Richard remained as expressionless as ever. Good. Let him think she didn't know. Let him believe, for just a little while longer, that he was still in control. Because tonight, Evelyn was going to make a plan. And when she executed it, Richard would never see it coming. Never again would she waste another moment of her life on a man who had stolen everything from her. For 23 years, she had given him everything. Now, she was going to take it all back. Evelyn woke up before dawn, the weight of what she had seen still pressing down on her chest. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange calmness settle over her. It was an unnatural stillness, one that came not from peace, but from clarity. There was no more doubt, no more second-guessing. The truth was laid bare before her, undeniable and infuriating. Richard had deceived her for 23 years. He had sat there, letting her carry the burden of their lives, while he indulged in a lie that had cost her everything. She turned her head slightly, listening for any movement from the next room. Nothing. Of course. He wouldn't risk anything during the day. The nights belonged to him. Not anymore. By the time the sun had fully risen, Evelyn had made her decision. She was going to leave. It wouldn't be easy. 23 years of habit didn't break overnight. There was a deep-rooted instinct inside her that had been conditioned to care for him, to see him as fragile, as helpless. But she wasn't going to let guilt hold her in place anymore. Not for a man who had stolen her life from her while she willingly handed it over, thinking it was love. She got up and moved through her morning routine with quiet efficiency. She made breakfast, folded clean laundry, even fluffed Richard's pillows. Everything as usual. She needed him to believe nothing had changed, but everything had. As she fed him, she looked at him closely, searching for something in his face. Did he feel guilt? Did he feel even a fraction of remorse? He chewed slowly, swallowed, then looked up at her with those same dull, expectant eyes. The rage simmered inside her, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she smiled. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle, practiced. Richard blinked once, his usual response, the one she had spent decades accepting. Not anymore. That night, once Richard was asleep, or at least pretending to be, Evelyn set her plan into motion. She retrieved the small flash drive where she had saved the footage from the hidden camera. She placed it inside a plain envelope along with a single note written in her neat, steady handwriting. "I gave you 23 years. You took them gladly. Now you can take care of yourself." She placed the envelope on the kitchen table, making sure it was the first thing he would see when he eventually got up, whenever he decided the house was empty enough to risk moving. Then she went to their bedroom and gathered the few things she needed. She didn't take much. Clothes, a small amount of cash she had hidden away over the years, never much, just a few dollars at a time, stashed in an old coffee tin at the back of the pantry. Enough to get her started somewhere else. She didn't take their wedding photo. She didn't take anything that tied her to this house, to this life. By the time she stood at the front door, bag slung over her shoulder, she felt lighter than she had in years. It was time. With one last look at the house that had been her prison for far too long, she walked out and didn't look back. When Richard woke up, the house was silent. It was always silent in the mornings, so he wasn't immediately alarmed. He lay there for a while, listening, waiting for the familiar sounds of Evelyn moving around, the clinking of dishes, the shuffle of her footsteps as she went about her morning routine. But nothing came. Frowning, he stayed still, listening harder. The silence stretched on. Slowly, cautiously, he lifted his head, then his shoulders. He sat up in bed, his ears straining. Still nothing. Something was wrong. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his feet touching the cold floor. He was stiff, his muscles weak from years of only using them in the dead of night. He knew he needed to be careful. If he fell, there would be no one to help him up. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself upright, standing on shaky legs. He reached for the wall, steadying himself, then took a slow, measured step forward. Then another. It felt different this time. Wrong. He was no longer moving through the house like a shadow, sneaking around while Evelyn was asleep. This time, he was alone. His stomach twisted as he made his way to the kitchen. And then he saw it. The envelope. Richard's hands trembled as he picked it up. He opened it, pulling out the small flash drive first, then the folded note. As he read the words, a cold weight settled in his gut. She knew. A wave of nausea crashed over him. His legs gave out, and he collapsed into the kitchen chair. She knew. How? His mind raced, his pulse hammering against his skull. How long had she known? How long had she been watching him, waiting, planning? He swallowed thickly, forcing himself to stay calm. Maybe she just needed time. Maybe she'd cool down and come back. Maybe. But deep down, he knew the truth. She was gone. And she wasn't coming back. For the first time in 23 years, Richard truly felt helpless. Not because he was paralyzed, but because now he had no one left to lie to. Evelyn walked through the streets of the unfamiliar town, her bag slung over her shoulder, the cold morning air biting at her skin. She had taken a bus, just the first one heading far enough away to give her space to think. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. For the first time in decades, she was free. A real, tangible kind of freedom, not the kind that came in small stolen moments while Richard slept. She could go anywhere. Do anything. She stopped in front of a small cafe, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Through the window, she saw a group of women sitting together, laughing over their coffee. They looked so light, untouched by the kind of burden she had carried for so long. A part of her ached. Another part of her stirred. She had been so consumed by Richard, his needs, his lies, that she had forgotten who she was. But not anymore. Evelyn straightened her shoulders and stepped inside, because for the first time in 23 years, she was about to start living for herself. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and something sweet, maybe cinnamon rolls just out of the oven. The warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the crisp morning air outside. Evelyn hesitated near the entrance, unsure for a moment whether she belonged here. The last time she had stepped into a cafe alone, just for herself, just because she wanted to, had been when? Before Richard's accident. Before she had stopped being a person and started being a caretaker. The thought sent a ripple of sadness through her, but she pushed it aside. This was a new beginning. She walked to the counter and ordered a simple black coffee, unsure what else to do with herself. It felt strange not having somewhere to rush off to, no responsibilities pulling at her, no schedule to keep. She had spent so long existing for someone else that the absence of duty left her almost weightless. The barista, a young woman with a bright smile, handed over her drink. "Enjoy your day," she said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Evelyn found a small table by the window, set her bag down, and wrapped her hands around the warm cup. She let herself sit there, simply existing, sipping coffee and watching people pass by outside. She was free. The thought came again, stronger this time. She was free. For the first time in 23 years, she didn't have to answer to anyone. She didn't have to wake up in the middle of the night to adjust pillows or check a feeding tube. She didn't have to dread coming home, knowing it meant more work, more sacrifice, more of herself being chipped away. She had left, and she wasn't going back. A woman sat down at the next table, flipping through a sketchbook, pencil moving swiftly across the page. Evelyn watched, entranced by the ease of her strokes, the way she lost herself in her work. Art. She had once loved art. She had once been good at it. A memory surfaced, her younger self, sitting on the floor of their old apartment, a canvas in front of her, Richard standing behind her. "You spend too much time on this," he had said, frowning. "It's not like it's going to pay the bills." That was the beginning. The first thing she had let go of. Now, sitting in the cafe, Watching a stranger create something from nothing, Evelyn felt a long dormant part of herself stir. She had spent so long caring for Richard that she had forgotten she had a life before him. She wanted that life back. She finished her coffee, stood, and walked to the woman's table before she could talk herself out of it. "Excuse me," she said, "do you know where I could take an art class?" The woman looked up surprised, then smiled. "Yeah, actually. There's a community center a few blocks away. They have open classes. You should check it out." Evelyn nodded, thanked her, and walked out of the cafe with a new sense of purpose. She was going to start over. The community center smelled of paint and paper and something familiar. Creativity, the kind she hadn't allowed herself to be part of for years. A friendly woman named Clara welcomed her, explaining the class structure, the materials provided, the freedom to create whatever spoke to her. Evelyn listened, nodded, absorbing every word, and then she picked up a brush. At first, her hand shook. She hadn't painted in over 2 decades. What if she had forgotten how? But as soon as the first stroke of color hit the canvas, something inside her unlocked. She wasn't painting a landscape or a portrait. She wasn't thinking about technique or composition. She was pouring herself onto the canvas, every bottled-up emotion, every lost dream, every unspoken thought. Blues and grays swirled together, dark and heavy, but in the center, a small burst of gold emerged, light in the darkness. She barely noticed the class ending, barely heard Clara's voice telling her she had talent, that she should keep going. All she knew was that she wasn't done. She needed more paint, more color, more life. So she came back. Again and again, every class, every free hour, until the walls of her tiny rented apartment were lined with canvases, each one a piece of her soul finally let free. And people noticed. Clara introduced her to local artists. A small gallery owner stopped by a class one evening, saw her work, and asked if she had ever considered exhibiting. Evelyn laughed at first. "Oh no, this is just for me." But the woman, Nancy, her name was, shook her head. "Art is meant to be seen, and your work says something." For the first time in years, someone wasn't looking at her with pity. They were looking at her with respect. And that changed something. Months passed. Evelyn's first exhibition was small but filled with people. Friends from her art class, locals who had seen her work, even some of the nurses she used to work with, surprised but proud to see her stepping into something new. She stood among her paintings, each one telling a story she had been too afraid to voice for years. And then she saw him, Richard. In a wheelchair now, looking thinner, weaker. He had actually deteriorated in her absence. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He looked lost. A part of her had expected to feel triumph, to feel satisfaction in seeing him diminished. But instead, all she felt was nothing. No anger, no hatred, no desire to see him suffer. He had taken 23 years from her, but she had taken the rest back. She turned away, walking toward a group of people admiring one of her paintings. She was done looking backward, because her life, her real life, was only just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and let them experience it too. And if you're ready for another gripping story, click on the next video on your screen. See you there.